Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Couple of Nukes. As always, I'm your host, Mr. Whiskey, and we address a lot on this show. We've addressed people's personal suicide experiences. We've talked about war. We've talked about religion. We've covered sexual immorality. We've covered pretty much everything I can think of off the top of my head. But today's subject is something we haven't covered, which is school shootings. We've gone over a little bit in some episodes about gun laws, about, society's views on guns, some, I'll call it improperly educated, beliefs on guns and people. It comes down to that classic question, do guns kill people or do people kill people? We've talked about knives versus guns. We've talked about self-defense. That was a very upsetting episode, to be honest, to hear about how America treats self-defense. And, a lot of people are afraid to talk about school shootings. We're not going to be encouraging them, of course. We're going to be talking about prevention and awareness. And in preparation for this episode, I was talking with some buddies of mine about, you know, most school shooters are inspired by previous ones. So it's true that publicity can have negative effects, but at the end of the day, the idea is going to formulate somewhere and someone's going to do it. So at least by showing and talking about prevention and awareness, you have a much greater chance of doing good than harm compared to none at all. And we are here today with Seth Ryan, a man who is passionate about that prevention and awareness, as well as a variety of other topics that we hinted at. So I'm going to let him introduce himself here for y'all. But if you take a look at his website, you can see a ton of photos showing a lot of military service, not just sitting around at port. He was out there in the action quite a bit. So, Mr. Ryan, great to have you here.
Great to be on. Couple of nukes. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, so let's start right there with, your military background.
Okay, so military background because I'm one of the strangest people you'll ever meet. I served in both the Marine Corps and Army Special Operations in the 75th Ranger Regiment in the Army. And then from there, I went into law enforcement and was a street cop while I was getting my degree, hoping to get into federal law enforcement because I was working in Baghdad and in Kabul in special ops, right next to the FBI, the Secret Service, the ATF, U.S. Marshals, and those guys were making six figures tax free, and they didn't really have to do anything. They didn't have to get shot at. We did all the work, and then they
Right.
swept in and collect some evidence, and they were getting paid, five, six times more than I was getting paid to be behind enemy lines. And you know, uh, after all of that, I was like, hey, how do I get your job in the chow hall? And the guy's like, well, hey, get your degree and apply. So that was my plan. Man, my life has been a roller coaster ever since, though. I All those things kind of fell through. I went federal law enforcement. I saw behind the curtain and the wizard, not very impressive. So unfortunately, uh, I had to make a new life change there. And because my wife and I and just our relationship, I wanted to try to be able to have kids, and we weren't having kids. So I went to the oil fields and lived on oil rigs for a little while in Oklahoma and Texas. And then the oil field crashed, and there I was again, sitting here going, with my background, what can I do? So I finished my master's degree and moved to Tampa, Florida, and that's where I live today. And now I once again jumped ship and went back overseas to make good money to do IVF. I now have an 18-month-old son, and IVF worked for us the very first attempt. But again, I ended up living through some pretty crazy circumstances. All of 2020, when you guys were going through COVID in America, I was going through it at a Baghdad embassy, which our gates had just been burned down. We were all about to be massacred and hung off a bridge. But because of the Trump administration green lighting special operations to come in and snatch up the right people, we are all alive today. Obviously, God is the reason we're alive, but green lighting those guys is the reason why Soleimani and the men that were coming to orchestrate our attack, the continued attack, they were killed, they were taken out, and I made it home. That ended up going in a direction to where I ended up not complying with some things that weren't going to be healthy for me. And now I'm home. I'm a private contractor, just helping people make their schools, their properties, big apartment complexes, large HOAs safer. And I just kind of do that while I take care of my son and we get ready for our next IVF baby that we're putting in 3 weeks.
Yeah, actually already done by the time this episode comes out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
congratulations on
I
that
appreciate that.
in the advance, but to the
Yeah.
past.
Yes.
What I'll say is you talked about, some of those higher ups making big figures and doing less. And we had a term in the Navy for the officers. We called them pencil pushers.
Mhm.
They, push around papers and pencils and get paid a lot more than us to do a
Right.
lot less. So
Right.
yeah, well, I've seen that, firsthand, and I've also seen those guys in the chow hall saying, "How do we end up doing that?" And
Yeah.
I don't think I could name a more American man than yourself. Marines, Army, cop, federal, th- and out of all the states, Texas and Florida, of
Right.
course.
Right.
It's like
Right.
you're like what other countries envision when they hear like American military man or just American man. Like you
Funny,
are.
I asked a girl out one time and she goes out with me and she starts asking me about myself and I start telling her and she's like, you are the strangest like combination of what people think of as a rugged person, because as a child I like to chop down trees. And so like I was dragging tires up and down my gravel driveway, but that's because I grew up in the 80s and 90s and there was nothing to do and I lived out in
Yeah.
the woods, so there was nothing to climb a tree, chop a tree, run, and like drag things around, be a mechanic like that. That's literally what I had to do as a child. So, yeah, I come from a very weird and Christian, very strict Christian background too. So, you know, I did all of those things you're talking about while never drinking alcohol in my entire life. Uh, I also, and this is one that people, if you don't know me, you will definitely get to know me if you follow any of my content, which is I don't curse, and that's again because my parents, beat that out of us if we ever said anything that sounded like we were trying to get toward a curse word, and so it just never has been in my vocabulary, and so I I will say freak all the time, freaking, but I don't say curse words. And been in the military, especially special ops, especially the Marine Corps, especially law enforcement, where everybody's functioning alcoholics every day. They're
And
so
some of
for
them believe
me,
that cursing makes them better leaders.
yeah, yeah. Well, and to be honest with you, I mean, there's a time and a place where somebody needs cussed out. I'm just not the guy that's going to be the one that
Yeah.
does that. I've always been the servant hearted. Before servant leader was a term that anybody knew, I just knew that all of the best leaders in the Bible and all the best leaders that I had ever met, that's how they led, from the front and by showing you, not by barking orders from the back and whipping you. So that's the type of leadership that I've always had. um, and so, what we were talking about earlier, I want to get back. You were saying about the school shooting. So just a real quick, the reason why I am so passionate about it, as you can see from my background, I have a very unique perspective on all those things because when I went to the oil fields, there was a time period where I was had been laid off from one oil field company I was working for and went to work for another, and I was doing private contracting bodyguard work for the oil field tycoons in Oklahoma. Um,
Mm.
and so I'm just hanging out. It wasn't like it was a rough job, and nobody's out there trying to assassinate those guys right now, and definitely not back then. And uh, so I've at that time, I when I was formulating my idea, what am I going to talk about on a podcast? I had met you at a podcasting event, and the advice I had been given is find a place where very few people are. It's something that you can intelligently talk about and that you wouldn't mind talking about, forever. It's something you got expertise in, and people will want to listen. That's what you want to do. So that's what I did, and that's where I started the School to Embassy project. The name comes from me working at the Baghdad Embassy, and what I learned from living at that embassy is that the embassy itself is not a scary building at all. It's exactly the opposite.
Mm.
It's actually it's very, very well constructed, and you can tell the material is very stout, but that doesn't make it look scary. And they purposefully make it just look like look like the other buildings in the area, but much more upscale, I guess you would say.
Right.
Not scary. That being said, if you have a suicide vest on and you open the front door and you try to open the second door, you're not getting through that door because that door locked behind you. You're locked in there, and the guy sitting on the other side of that wall or staring at you, pushing the button, goes, "You're stuck, buddy. You got nowhere to go. You can't kill anybody. You're done." And that's when I started formulating the idea there should be rings of security within our school system. Obviously, not to the level of an embassy, but rings where things can be, where a person who comes to do harm is first seen, as first notifying, somebody who can immediately react to that. Because if you get past that ring, then you are going to be seen by the cameras on this ring. And if you make it past that ring, and what I started looking into school shootings, there's nobody talking about this topic on a
Right.
regular enough basis to me at all. And the main thing, the reason why I had to start the podcast was I started looking into Columbine. I started looking into the Stoneman Douglas shooting. I started looking into Sandy Hook. I started looking into Uvalde. And what I found out is that all the things I thought I knew about them were flat out wrong. All the things that I had been told by the media, not true. And so it completely blew my mind, especially Columbine, because I was in high school. I graduated in 1999. So when that happened, I was in high school. This was a big deal. Like that was just every day people are talking about it, and the jokes were going around who's going to be the school shooter here. And then that was when I was friends with all kinds of people, and there was a couple kids who loved Marilyn Manson and wore trench coats, and they were very, very good at math. I was student of the year in math my senior year. And so we actually come to find out years later, us three were on the list that the police had formulated of who are the most likely kids to be school shooters, because they thought they're loners, they don't belong in a specific club. Anybody who talks to the Marilyn Manson kids, because those guys are for sure the ones. And it was just like anybody associated with them. And then they thought anybody who gets good grades, like that's what they ran on. Anybody who happens to talk to these kids who wear face makeup and were like the most benign, like they weren't
Yeah.
intimidating, and they certainly weren't kids who knew how to use a gun. But that I just remember that from high school. And then I started to do research, and the more I read, the more I understood that I didn't understand anything. And so that's where I started reaching out to the people that I had to bring on my podcast, which are two-star Marine general, the guy who started a retired colonel, special operations. He had worked with everybody you can name, General McCraven, Admiral, like all of the people that you've heard of that ran the army, that ran special operations during the war. He's been in the room with those guys. He's spent time with those guys. So I brought him in, got his perspective. And what I quickly found out was that a um, the more you talk about the topic, uh, the less other podcasters want to talk with you. And that's where I'm at today. You are one of the few people that want to have me on the podcast. And again, that's why I say I really appreciate the opportunity. Regardless of all the things I've done in my background, that doesn't mean that people are going to just automatically bring me onto their podcast. I have to fit the demographic of their audience. And there's far too many people out there that are scared of being shadow banned, that are scared of hot button topics, is the
Yeah.
way it's been phrased to me. And that I personally am a hot button topic, because even talking about school shootings means automatically shootings brings up guns. And the fact that you even hear the word gun, or don't even say the word gun, but if you think of the word gun on this topic, then that makes me a hot button topic, and they want to stay away from that. So that's where I'm at today. And it's
Right. But
a
if you were
little
talking
disheartening.
about BDSM and bestiality, they'd say, we'd love to have you on the podcast. It's
Exactly.
of course, I'll say it's a politically biased where, if your hot button conversation is on the right rather than the left, then typically that's how it works in the podcasting industry and in news in general. But yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong about it. Like I said, we're not encouraging it. And I'm in the same boat as you as now I've never been told by any, official police officers or anything like that, but by other students and people in my life, I've always been called school shooter. Every time I've taken an ID photo, I've been
Mhm.
told that I either look like a serial killer, a murderer, or a school shooter. I don't know. I have a serious resting face, and yeah, and it's funny. I've even had people tell me, I won't confirm or deny if I own firearms, but if I did, I'd have a lot of people say, well, that means you're going to end up being a school shooter. It means that you're this, this, and that, and guns should only X, Y, Z, and there's a lot of improper education around. And here's the thing. I do support, the right to bear arms, but I believe that it should be required for everyone to be educated on them, and whether that's through the public school system or something else. Even if you're never going to own one or shoot one, just to understand how they work, safety about it, and especially if you're going to buy one. That's one of my issues with the constitutional carry. Like here in Georgia, you can just buy it, as long as everything checks out with your background, pretty much, you can buy it. There's no required safety course or anything like that. But of course, we're going to get into some of the myth busting with school shootings in terms of are most of the guns legal or illegal? What kind of people do it? But I want to start with a question going back to you talked about making schools safer. One of the most controversial debates is should we arm teachers? If teachers pass a background check and they're safe, but that leaves the possibility, what if the teacher snaps mentally? What if? So I'd love to know, as someone who has really looked into the news articles, done the research, hosted a podcast on it, and, talks about this stuff, what is your personal opinion? Again, everyone, this is Mr. Ryan's personal opinion on arming teachers or having an armed guard at the school. Two different questions, starting with the teachers.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and great question. I've actually, so I was with the job that I'm doing, I was deciding between that or being an armed guard here in Tampa for their school system because they actually have armed guards and it's not the same as like going and getting a regular security officer license. You
Right.
actually go through the school system. They put you through a police created Pasco County school system created this essentially miniature police training for you so that they're already going to bring in somebody who is very familiar with weapons, somebody who is a veteran of usually law enforcement and or military veteran. And so that I actually was looking into. Ultimately, I just decided with this job, the reason why I'm able to have a podcast with you in the middle of the week is because as a private contractor, I can choose when I work. And so yesterday I worked and now I'm off for the rest of the week. That's all the jobs I needed this week to do for my schedule. So yes, as far as school, as far as arming teachers, so we'll start there. I would say this: I'm not I'm not a proponent that we should automatically require, because there's some people out there that are very loud on the right that are pushing, that really push for this, that if you're a teacher and this is their stance, if you're a teacher, you are in the position of being a shepherd. You have to protect your flock, and that's the way I've heard it phrased many
I've heard
times.
that too. Yeah.
And because a teacher, if you sit down and do a personality profile of a teacher, that is the exact opposite of a firearm carrying police officer, detention officer, FBI agent. It's not the same type of person. It's not the same type of competency either. The person that was the best in my school at teaching me math, and the reason why I made it to student of the year was because of him. I don't think I'd trust him with a firearm. And it's because he was so cerebral. He was so good at taking complex things, breaking it down, and making you as a high school student able to understand this. That doesn't mean that he can put on a blindfold and now take apart a rifle or a pistol and put it back together, in 60 seconds. That's
Right.
two totally different types of people. And so that's where I would start with the conversation, because there's a lot of teachers that less I would the number of people that would shoot students by snapping versus the number of people who would accidentally shoot themselves, accidentally shoot a student, accidentally shoot a gun in the just because they're mishandling it. Or worst case scenario, a student goes through that teacher's bag. A student thinks it's a funny game to play a prank on the teacher and goes and gets their gun and hides it from them, but accidentally shoots themselves. Accidentally, the gun goes off. There's a million scenarios there where that's not a good idea. That being said, if you're a teacher who has been raised with firearms, is very comfortable with firearms, spends a lot of time training it, I think that we should have a place where the teachers that are capable and are willing and are competent should absolutely be allowed to do so. But it should also be very heavily regulated as far as the school goes, of them being like not regulated like sitting there looking over their shoulder, but like, hey, here's a safe that's in the classroom that only the combination to. And there's a buddy of mine that he had sent his son off to the SEALs, and like he's just a very very grown up with guns and everything, and he has multiple kids. And he said, growing up with all these kids in the house, this is what I have next to my bed. It's my fingerprints that go on it. When my hand goes on that, it opens for me only, and so I can grab my gun. It's already loaded, one's in the chamber, and I can go defend my house. That something like that would be ideal, to where the gun isn't being taken back and forth, and
Right.
only they're going to be able to get to it. Obviously, it'd have to be bolted down, because some kids are going to break into the school and try to steal the gun. Like that's the way it is. You like as you think that through. But I would say something like that um, would be a good happy medium between the two, because you've got teachers that really are. If I became a teacher, I would hope that you would want me to carry a gun in that school. And it only takes one good guy with a gun to stop the bad guy. If the reason why schools are being attacked is because they're the gun free zone and everybody knows it. If you don't know if the teachers are armed there, just take a look at the exact same numbers for if you don't know if somebody's carrying concealed carry. The exact same thing. People are much less likely to go try to commit a violent crime if they don't know who's carrying a firearm. So that would be my answer. And having talked to teachers here in Tampa and principals, because I have several friends at church that are principals as well, they would say, "Man, you do not understand the teachers that we have here. You don't understand how I am as a teacher. I would not trust me, even if my life were in danger. Especially don't trust me with a gun, because I would be fumbling and scared and freezing." And so again, yeah, you've got to have somebody who knows that they're capable of handling that situation. And that's where a combat veteran or prior law enforcement who's wanting to do security, I think, is the answer to that.
You know what's interesting is we never talk about non-lethal alternatives. At the end of the day, we always just say either teachers are armed with guns or they're not. We never say what about tasers, tranquilizers or other means of non-lethal, force. So I think it's really interesting that we never have those conversations about, again, it's the same exact concerns. If I'm a teacher with a taser on me, and like you said, kids are going to be kids, whether they're middle schoolers or high schoolers. Oh, Mr. Whiskey has a taser on his belt. What if we tased him?
Yeah.
That's how kids are, and it's sad, but
I
it's
think you're
it's
saying
it's
that's how you were as a kid.
no, no, no. I was
Okay.
I was
Okay.
well behaved. I was the smart loner who was on this probably on the school shooting list, So
Yeah.
I was not a troublemaker, but I know plenty of people who were. I've seen people who, like you said, even try to like break into the safe and all that stuff. I mean, it's true.
Yeah.
I know people who would say, "Hey, we just got to get the teacher's, handprint on it and all that stuff." So even that is a thing,
Yeah.
trying to get the combination, trying to guess the combination, whatever they can do.
Yeah.
And it's just human behavior, whether it's curiosity or just the way they were, brought up. So again, the same concerns with if we did non-lethal, alternatives. And
Yeah,
it's sad that we live in a society where we need to have a third party, at the schools to protect our children. But at the end of the day, acceptance is better than complaining, right? Because at least that gets us somewhere, that gets, stuff done.
yeah,
And so, you know, let's talk about you talk about it whether the teachers are armed or not. You talk about multi-tiered security design for the schools,
layers.
and you brought up walls previously. Obviously, schools, we're not going to build a moat and a castle and a bridge full of alligators, but
Right.
what does that look like for you based on what you've seen other schools maybe starting to implement or what you'd like to see implemented?
So just because you mentioned the moat thing, I have to mention when you look at some of the best protected embassies on the planet, what you see is they're some of the most beautiful. And so the water having a small, and being in Florida, it's super easy because everywhere's water and people just love water here. Like it's kind of strange to me coming from the Midwest, because we have big lakes and then that's
Right.
it, and we got a big lake and that's it. Here, everybody has a puddle in their backyard,
For
but you
sure.
can use that. You build that in front of an embassy, and automatically you don't have to have an alligator in there. In Florida, it's automatic. There's going to be alligators
Yeah.
there. Legitimately, who can run through that? Well, you can't. So automatically, you just essentially built a concrete wall that nobody's going through. And that's the way you have to think of these things. You don't think of it as it has to be this over the top razor wire, concertina wire, spiked tip top. And if you drive through Miami, which is where I do a lot of my assessments, you see the whole neighborhood where Section 8 housing and in a rough area. You already know it's a rough area when you drive through there in the middle of the day. uh, Aside from the graffiti, if you see spiked fences everywhere, especially the front yard, the whole thing is fenced in. They drive their car in, they have to get out and move the
Yeah.
little gates to even get in there. That's over the top, especially for a school. And also, it creates an environment where you are, I wouldn't say you're scared to go to school, but it's a constant reminder that that it is dangerous and that people are wanting to do you harm and all those things. And although there's a whole lot of mumbo jumbo about that that's been spread, and there's a whole lot of touchy feely ideas out there, and at the end of the day, I do want my son to come back home, and I don't care if there's a spiked, right? If that was it, if that was saved everything, if that saves every
Right.
kid, then let's put up spike fences. But that's not going to. So finding solutions such as something that looks as inviting as a big little pond. Essentially, I keep calling them lakes here, but a big size little pond in front of the school on this side. And you've got if you have a roving guard that is constantly patrolling the property. And this is something that I worked for about a year and a half in a federal prison, while I was trying to get the back door into the big guys, the ATF, U.S. Marshals, all that. And what I learned real quick from going and doing the patrol on the outside to being in the tower with the rifles is that it's not one thing. If you just had towers all the way around, there's going to be one guy who falls asleep, and that's going to be the area that they could escape from.
Yeah. For
If
sure.
there's just a patrol guy and there's no towers, well, they can time that guy and get around. So it has
Exactly.
to be, and this is what I would love to see is it's no matter what physical defenses, walls, things you put up, we're humans, we're smarter than that. We're always going to be able to find a way around it. What's what you have to do with layers is you have to have advanced warning from the exterior that people aren't aware of. Okay. And so that's where cameras for buildings that are around the school, that somebody is monitoring at all times while school is taking place, including after hours when basketball games are going on, baseball games. That's where, if you look at every school shooting, the kids are never landing in a spaceship or a helicopter on top of the roof and
Yeah.
then going through the building. They're coming from a distance. And even though the Parkland shooting down here in Florida, that one he actually got dropped off at the door by a Uber driver or Lyft driver or whatever. That's the closest. Like most of the time, they parked in a parking lot and they're dressed. They've got a rifle in their hands. They're wearing this gear. It's super obvious this person is going to commit a violent crime. That should have already been seen on camera and people should be alerted. The teachers within that school system should have already heard the alarm go off and that they should have automatically locked their doors and hid their kids. Now, and Parkland is one of the most, it's one of the most perfect examples of how this could have played out, and how it did for everybody on the second floor. The first floor, he comes in, he wasn't dressed. He gets dropped off. He had everything in a duffel bag because he had actually went and researched and learned that lesson from all those other kids who had all parked away or is coming on foot,
Right.
run in, and then people saw them and they were kind of already caught. He goes into the stairwell on that one and then gets dressed in the stairwell. Well, a little kid walked in on him. I said, little kid, one of the students. A student walked in while he's getting dressed. Why there's not a camera in that stairwell immediately alerting the
Exactly.
law enforcement and they're hitting the lockdown button, that would have automatically saved countless lives. That wasn't there. If you had dummy cameras around, you don't, even if the cameras are expensive, so you only end up getting a certain number, having similar dummy cameras. And so a lot of places, a lot of businesses have some real cameras around and some dummy cameras, and you never know which one's actually working and which ones aren't. That's a very good deterrent because again, you don't know which ones are and which ones aren't. He goes into the stairwell, gets dressed. So already he shows up with a duffel bag that he would have gotten past the first layer, but he's having to get dressed somewhere. That's where that second layer, a kid shows up with a duffel bag and just goes right into the bathroom. That should raise some suspicion. The officer on campus should have been alerted to go check him out. Again, that would have saved many kids' lives. He gets dressed, he starts shooting everybody on the first floor. The kids on the second floor and the teachers on the second floor heard the shooting, and so they all turned out the lights and hid out of sight of that window. Now, there should have been some type of a covering, and now a lot of schools do that, and that's very simple, but it's very effective as well, because if you can't see in, you can't see in, and so you
Right.
just don't know. He goes through the entire second floor, shoots 0 people. All their lives are saved because again, if the early warning had gone out, that's what everybody would have done. And it's very
Yeah.
hard to shoot people like this, and kids aren't smart enough to know bullets, how well a bullet goes through the wall. Typically speaking, they're
Right.
not
Right.
thinking that far ahead. So that's a great example. He goes up to the third floor. They didn't hear the first floor shootings because they're all the way on the third floor. And so he pulls the fire alarm. They all come out in the hallway, and then it's a free for all. So one of the interesting things about that shooting too on the third floor is that the teachers, when interviewed for a documentary that I listened to, and it's on Amazon, it's free. You should definitely go and watch that one because you would learn so much just about what happened in Stoneman Douglas. The teachers all said that he was wearing some type of a mask. Other kids said he was definitely not wearing a mask. He was wearing some type of shooting glasses. What somebody sees in that moment can be very wide ranging. Some people saw him wearing nothing. Some saw him wearing glasses. Some saw him wearing a face shield.
Right.
Which is it? Because it's not all the same. And he definitely didn't wear all those different combinations. Here's the other thing. He starts shooting, and instead of when fire alarm goes off, everybody pours out into the hallway. Now, prior to, it says it on the documentary, so I'll probably mess this up, but prior to the shooting, it was only a couple days prior to the shooting or a couple weeks, Parkland High School in Parkland, Florida, specifically was labeled by a news outlet or whatever the safest place in the state of Florida. That school ran drills on active shooter all the time. And one of the most, to me, the thing that absolutely made a knot in my stomach was when the teacher said over and over through the whole documentary, we had been trained on this over and over. And so when it happened, I thought it was a drill. Every kid that while taking bullets into the child next to them still thinks this is on Valentine's Day. That is a paintball gun. This is a joke. Those are not bullets going into this kid. All that blood must be paintballs because
Wow.
this has to be a drill. And that is something that no one has ever talked about. That should give everyone pause. If your training costs people their lives, you have to go, stop. We just implemented this. This sounded like a great idea. Here it is in real life. This just cost people their lives. Let's rethink this. And that's where you have to sit back and go, okay, that's not me Monday morning quarterbacking, just trying to scrutinize you. But I'm telling you, if I was a police officer and my training put me in a position where I was almost killed and other police officers were killed, that thing that you taught me, I would never use again in real life. This is where I think the realistic practice that they do, man, it has to be realistic. And I don't believe that schools are investing the least amount of money that they can. They're doing the best that they can. It is the best that they know to do.
Right.
What I'll tell you is when you go through bodyguard school for the Department of State, when you go through active shooter training as a police officer, and then as a police officer, I had a secondary job that I was contracted to help train the Border Patrol CBP pilots on how to interact and be a gun toter again, because they're pilots. They almost never get into a situation where they've ever had to pull their gun anymore. They just go back and forth and get on a plane and fly around. The other guys on the ground do all the gun toting, and that's what their job is. So they're used to it. These guys, they wanted the guy that was in charge of Custom Border Protection was like, hey, but what happens if? What happens if you go to and you're stopped at 7-Eleven? What if you're stopped at Wawa? What if you're stopped at Circle K? You're getting gas and then you see this happen. And so we ran these scenarios, and we're police officers, all of us. So we put them through real world scenario. We put them through exactly what dudes had actually done to us in real life. And or several of us are combat veterans too,
Right.
like the way it is in combat. And that blew some guys' minds. I mean, literally men froze with fear. And when I say froze, I mean like, this is a 35-year-old man who is screaming like a child at the instructor who, time out, I don't know. And I'm like, bro, you've been carrying a gun. You've been through the Federal Law Enforcement Academy. You've been doing
Right.
this for over a decade. You've been doing this for 15 years. And you just realized that if somebody didn't even point a gun at you, they grabbed a hostage, that you would freak out and just completely freeze and lose your mind. Um, so when doing that type of training, I think that would open up a lot of people's minds as to how serious they need to take this. And what I personally believe, without being at every school in America while they do this training, whenever you can go look on Google at pictures for school shooting training, and what you're going to see is a lot of people laying down with little, whatever fake blood stuff squirted on them, and you're going to see kids doing this, laying on the ground smiling. You're going to see police officers going in the pictures.
Yeah.
Everybody knows this is a stupid checkbox. They're going through the motions. They're trying not to get in trouble. They're tired. It's the end of the day, and that's the way people are treating it. People are
Yeah.
not obviously. I'm sure there's some that are not. However, the school that's going to have a shooting next month the month after that, the month at whatever month it is, whenever it happens next, it's going to be at a school where they don't take it serious. And that's an early prediction, because the reason why they're doing shootings at schools is because there's people without guns and people can't defend themselves. The reason why it will again be at a school where the officer isn't prepared, where the people aren't prepared, is because kids aren't stupid. And if a kid knows that they could do a school shooting, they know that because they've probably participated in or watched. You don't think a school shooter is going to go actively seek out and watch how they do it? You're literally, that's the other thing. We're literally giving the enemy the playbook and walking them through
Hmm.
our
Yeah.
training. And that's the scary thought, right? The kids that we're trying to protect are the ones that are the school shooters. They're mixed in there. You never know which one's going to be the school shooter. Who wants to volunteer to be a part of the school shooting training tonight? Oh, that kid's hand's going up. Well, I think you like guns a little bit too much there, Mr. Whiskey. You don't get to volunteer, but I really want to help, and I think it's important. Of course, that kid's going to be the one involved, and of course, that kid's going to sit there and watch them walk through exactly how they do it, and then they're going to literally game plan and defeat exactly what you have in mind, and that's all you've planned for. So you don't do contingencies, you don't do a bunch, because you don't have time for that, I'm funding for that, blah blah blah.
Right.
You go through the what's been taught to you, what your police department has come up with their plan, or you fall back on the federal training. At the end of the day, people will have to take this serious everywhere, and it has to be as close to pushing somebody to a point of failure, of stress, to where you are
Right.
literally being shot at with simunition rounds. It hurts. And I mean, like, I've got scars still from that training. And I've literally point blank, been like, he pulled his gun on me and he didn't shoot. I was like, bro, I've got a gun pointed at you. I'm supposed to shoot you right now, but I'm not allowed to because you're too close. I'm telling you right now, shoot me. And he's like, okay, okay. And then he shoots me. And I'm like, I had to tell a federal agent to shoot
Right.
me. It was too close, but I didn't care. At that moment, I was like, dude, I'm covered in stuff. It's gonna hurt, but I need you to get this through your head. You can shoot me. And he stopped because it was a game to him. He was still in game mode. And he knows that in training prior to this, the rule is you can't shoot within, 3 feet of being that close because it'll break your skin. I was like, but I knew in that moment, I was like, this guy has to get through that. You shoot me, execute me
Right.
right now. I've got a gun pointed at you. You have to shoot me. I'm not going to shoot you, but you better shoot me. And then he shot me. But it's that type of mentality. You go through the training prior to the you go through the rules of the training. There's no rules in the real world, and so you're gonna have to tell people, this is how we're gonna have one shooter in here, we're gonna do this, da, da, da. And then they come in and that's not what it is at all. They're on another floor. It's a multi terrorist attack, it's a multi-shooter attack,
Yeah.
it's a follow-on attack. And this is an early unfortunate prediction, because kids are smart, and they're eventually going to go to a point to where it's going to be Columbine, where you have two shooters instead of one, or it's going to be three shooters. And heaven help us, God help us not to ever get to that point. But at some point, kids are going to get other kids involved, and they will buddy up, and it will be a same thing
Massacre.
as
Yeah.
pull a fire alarm to get everybody going this way. You shoot at them, you're going to get some, but at the bottom of the
Concerted.
stairwell where they're all funneling down, that's where I'm going to be standing. And I've got some pipe bombs that I built. I've got really the best rifle. You got a pistol, I've got the rifle down here. And it's going to be a multi-level attack, not just a single individual who shoots a few pop shots, and then the police come and
Right.
so unfortunately that's the way it's going. It's evolving. um, and it won't stop until kids stop idolizing the people who have come before them. And that's the media keeps pushing the shooters names, and kids keep pushing those students, the shooters names around. and talking about them as if they are some type of Hollywood celebrity.
Yeah.
We have the guy who recently in the news shoots whoever it was, the money mogul up in New York, Chicago. I forget where it was now off the top of my head, but
You're
he
talking
just,
about the healthcare CEO
yes,
with
healthcare
Luigi.
CEO. That's what it was. I couldn't remember which. It was healthcare CEO. He shoots him. They find him. Now what is that guy bombarded with? Marriage proposals and fan mail. What are we doing? That's our society. How do you fix that? I mean, you and I aren't going to, and no school is going to. When you have a society that is so twisted that a serial killer sees themselves receiving constant adoration, constant love, constant communication from all of these women that want to now be with them, people who want to interview them, documentaries made about their lives, and they look at their life, especially in high school, and go, "I'm nobody. I'm gonna die a nobody. I was gonna commit suicide, but why not be world famous? Why not be talked about and taught about for the rest of history as one of the big school shooters? All I have
Yeah.
to do is
If you
get
can't be famous, be infamous kind of thing.
back."
And I want to cut in and address a couple of things you talked about. In the Navy, I was a nuclear operator, and one of the things we talk about is, the reactor is always dangerous and complacency kills. When you're doing a drill, it's still a live reactor, or even if the reactor shut down, you always treat it like something could go terribly wrong. And that's not just reactor side, that's military side across. And it's supposed to be, complacency kills. Always same, even that mindset people are supposed to have with the ocean. Any day you go to the beach could be the last one. That the ocean can always kill you. I understand what you're saying with the lockdowns, the school shooting drills, that people become complacent. They think this is a drill, this is another drill, and I know schools have tried to combat that by no longer announcing that it's a drill. They used to announce, I know when I was growing up, you would be told if it was drill, and then at some point that changed to it can or cannot be a drill. It may or may not be a drill. But even then, like you said, people are going to assume it is one way or the other. Especially there's there's the whole kid mentality where if I'm trying to treat it like it's a real drill and everyone else isn't, well now I'm outcasted. They're like, look at Mr. Whiskey's so paranoid, or look at he's a baby, he's treating this like it's real, and everyone else is treating it like a drill, for example. Um, so one of the things you suggested, which is you talk about hot topics and controversial, you talk about making the drills even more realistic. I mean, that's definitely something that a lot of parents are going to want to push back on, saying that's bad for the students' mental health, for their social dynamics and all of that. And then one thing you said that is so important that sticks with me more than anything is the shooters most of the time have inside information. I mean, you talked about the people we are teaching the plan of protection to may become the person who is trying to destroy that plan. So and I think that's pretty simple to understand, but for an example, let's say I know I don't watch football, but let's say, you're the quarterback, you're going over the whole plan with the team, and then one of your guys goes and plays for the other side against you. Well, he already knows all the moves you're about to make. He just, went through all of it. So just how do we combat that? I mean, how do we combat there is there any way to do that? I mean, and you talk about realistic training and all across. And, talking about the glorification. Yeah, I mean, people will say, well, we're holding them accountable. We're putting their name in the news so people know. Yes, it's accountability. But you can look at any leader in history, good or bad, and it doesn't matter what you hold them accountable to or how you punish them. I think Benito Mussolini, they hung him upside down naked and everything. There's still people who glorify him, who want to be like him. There's people who want to be like Rasputin, Putin, Kim Jong-un, Trump, Biden, Reagan. It doesn't matter. You can name any leader. And there are people who are for them and people who are against them. It doesn't matter good or bad. And so when you're trying to hold accountability, so that brings the question, well, do we need to punish school shooters differently? Do we need to, I don't want to say torture, that sounds awful, but do we need to show some, is there any way to have consequences so dreadful that no one ever thinks of being a school shooter? I mean, is there any way to even do that? Because at the end of the day, a person who is broken, like you said, has nothing to live for. If their life doesn't matter, there's nothing you can scare them with, really.
Right. So, so a couple questions there go back to the, combating when we're literally teaching the children how to actually get around what we're going to do. That was a great point with a quarterback because that happens all the time right now in college football, and that happens a lot in college football with the coaches, and even more so because the coach not only knows what the playbook is, you could change the playbook. The coach knows the scheme. The coach knows what the point of how you even do this is. And so that's where the difference has to lie. We have to teach kids so that they survive. 100%. You have to teach the kids what to do. Good example. Let's go just with a very baseline example. Kids in Columbine, you watch documentaries, look into that at all. If kids in Columbine had done the run, hide, fight, many of those children would have lived. Almost everybody in the library would have just ran out of the library, but they didn't. They froze out of fear because they had no idea this could ever even exist, that this would be a reality. And so they just hunkered down underneath a desk. So 100% we have to make sure that kids know they could run outside of the door, they could get out of the windows, even if it's a multi-level like Parkland's 3 stories. You've got to have, I don't care
I
if you,
gotta stop you right there with an idea because at my school, and I've heard this at other schools, they said, do not run. If you run, we will assume you are the shooter. So what do you have to comment on that? Because there are
really.
schools out there I've heard that they said, if you run, we will assume that you are part of the shooting and that you are, trying to get away from the police. And this was very controversial because a lot of people said, listen, if I hear bullets, I'm leaving. And you can try to arrest me later on if you want, and that'll be that. But I'm not sitting here like a sitting duck to get shot at. So, I mean, what you're saying that run, hide, fight, at least in my personal experience, from my school and what I've heard other people is it's being put forth hide, run, fight, which sounds weird. It sounds out of order, but that's what I grew up being taught in my school systems and what people, from my generation were also taught. So.
Wow. That's news to me, to be honest, because I've never run across anybody who said that. Everything that I've found put out by the federal government, the FBI, and Catherine Schweit with all of her books, right? How to Stop the Killing. Um, um, all of it is in that same order. We run first, first and foremost, the most advantageous way that you could survive that scenario is to not be there. And so
Agreed. I agree 100%.
that has to be what we do. The idea that it's more important that we contain the school shooter than we let more children survive. From my experience, common sense primarily, and as well all of my training, that has to be one of the dumbest ideas brought about by somebody who has obviously never had any type of training whatsoever, military, law enforcement, or any experience in any capacity.
You're saying the priority is,
The survival
containing
of
the shooter
children.
over saving lives.
Right, exactly. Yep. So that to me is insane that somebody would, with a straight face, tell children when people start shooting, you need to hunker down and be a target when he gets here. You need to stay here so you could be a hunkered down, trapped. And that's what, listen to the documentaries on Columbine, on Parkland, on there's several of them, Sandy Hook, on all those. The kids who ended up there, and there's the one exception, right? Sandy Hook, where the teacher hides all the kids, they're tiny kids, hides them in a tiny closet, and and shuts them, and then she stands outside. And when he comes to her door, she says, there's no one in here, it's just me, and he murders her. She gave her life for those kids. That's really the only, off the top of my head, uh, full success of all the
Right.
children hiding. That being said, Parkland, second floor, as I mentioned, all those kids hid. He shot 0 people on that floor. Not saying that it can't happen, because it can.
Yeah.
However, if the kids on the third floor had been aware of the shooting, let's say that they had heard the shooting just like the second floor, then had they run, many more of them would have survived than the ones that ended up being killed. So if you just look at it, if you just go to each one of the school shootings and go, okay, what if they had run? Well, then when he pulls the fire alarm, there's not a lot of kids there because they've already started running. Now, that
Right.
could mean they could run into him, but that also means they could only run into him in one stairwell because he's not flying through the floor. And when the kids went to, he was coming up the stairwell. When some kids ran to the stairwell, some kids saw him and came back the other way, but everybody's piling in and they couldn't like get away, and it was all confusion. He also starts shooting, and because his ammo is dirty, you and I know because we shot guns before, dirty ammo creates a cloud of, and especially if there's no fan or anything to take that away. And everybody said that in the Parkland shooting documentary as well, is that the whole, it was like it was a concert. It was just covered in cloud, and they couldn't
Mm.
see what was going on. And that's where his gun jammed. Now, and this is the point, his gun jammed, and he was sitting there trying to clear it, and he's not military law enforcement, so it took him a good little bit of taking it out and trying to fix a jam. He probably has one that's stuck in the chamber, and he's trying to get it
Yeah.
back out. So that's what he was most likely doing. And there were many seconds. Nobody knows for sure. Some saw him with a mask, some without. So we don't know for sure, but we know that he had to take his magazine out and sit there and clear the jam, then reinsert it. All that time, everybody's running into each other and everything's going crazy. Had they started running first, before there's a cloud to confuse them, before he gets up there to pull the fire, right? So that's where, if you actually just sat down and went, okay, I'm not going to say for sure of anything, but let's just mathematically figure out what would be more likely: him not doing him not creating a cloud of confusion, everybody's not running into each other. Had they run, how many more kids would have survived? So you could do that with each one of them if you'd like. However, common sense tells you it's more important for your kid to make it home to you than it is for them to identify who the shooter is. The idea that the shooter is going to go shoot all these kids everywhere and then drop his stuff and pretend to be one of the students just happened. That happened in Michigan. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was shooting kids with a pistol, and then and I know this because I interviewed the lady and she was on my podcast. You should definitely listen to her episode because she had insider knowledge. She was right. She
Wow.
actually controlled the Facebook page for the whole town. And that kid was trying to do that. He was going to try to pretend like he was just a student that was a victim.
Yeah.
And he dumped the gun into the trash and then sat down. Everyone in that school already knew this kid was going to be the school shooter. He was drawing pictures of shooting kids, shooting his classmates. Were saying that he's going to shoot people. He's threatened. Like, come on. And like, that's the other thing you and I both, and everybody else who's ever been through high school knows. There's not a whole lot of people out there that could that is going to make it through the full process of becoming a school shooter and 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 not be acting so strange that everybody knows.
There's warning signs, and we're gonna get into some
Yeah,
mental health stuff with that. But I mean, and again, I'm not encouraging his actions at all. But if it were me, I would have maybe even shot myself somewhere non-lethally to cover make it even less
of
likely.
course.
If he had shot himself, it's gonna be like, would he really go through the trouble? Like, Yeah, again, I'm not encouraging, not trying to
No,
promote any of this,
and
but
that the reality is that's almost not going to happen. And here's, even if it did, it wouldn't. Somebody's going to have seen him shooting the gun. So somebody already knows. So he could do
oh yeah,
that, but
yeah.
that would just, he would just be in custody at the hospital and he would screw himself over. And I think kids are smart enough to know that they might squirt ketchup on their leg, but that, again, that's not going to fool you for very long. And at the end
Yeah.
of the day, these kids aren't master criminals, and so again, running is the most important thing. It really is, to get out of there.
Yeah.
And if you again have a warning system that this person's coming, that's your first layer. And then the secondary, and I did skip this before, schools should have two police trained, if they're not, if they're armed guardians like Texas has, or Florida, that you have a somebody who's prior law enforcement, military, maybe retired, but they have to be physically fit. They should still be made to pass a PT test every single year they're employed, not once and you're done like all police departments that I know of in the Midwest, like all of our departments,
Yeah,
right?
it's true. Every security officer that I've seen at schools is either overweight or older and retired and just doing it part time. It's not, it's just like as long as they have the gun, that's all that matters. But you and I both know it's more than just that.
So, and they need to be two. The psychological difference between you and another guy who has a gun going after one shooter, and if we both have pistols and he has a rifle, there is, right, there's still that, we found out in Uvalde, there's still people that just aren't cut out for this work, and put and aren't going to go forward. He's got a rifle, I've got a pistol, I'm just going to stay back here and watch.
You're
And
saying by having two, if one fails to do the job, hopefully the other officer will pick up the
I'm
slack, so to
saying you're
speak.
much more likely, and this again is combat experience. Is there's a reason why two snipers go out. There's a reason why there's two, even if you're a Ford observer
It's
and
that
a
power
regular.
numbers, battle buddy mentality that, hey, he's got my back, I've got his. We can
Yes,
take this guy together. But if I was alone, who am I?
that, and it's, you have to overcome so much more fear if you're by yourself than if you're with one other guy,
Yeah,
and
yeah, for
that
sure.
that applies to getting out on a dance floor. I don't know if you've watched any videos on that, but there's several TED Talks that I've listened to, and one that was really good. And it talks about, it doesn't matter what you're trying to change. If you
Yeah,
are at a park and you get up and you start dancing crazy, everyone's just going to look at you. But if there's one other person, and that person is more important than the person who starts it, the second person who gets up and smiles and does what you're doing, then everybody at the park jumps up and starts acting crazy and doing whatever you guys are doing. And it's because if one other person says or shows that what you're doing is not only okay, it's kind of fun, we should all do this, that opens the floodgates. But without that second person, you're just a crazy person dancing by yourself at the park. Same thing in a scenario like that.
yeah,
You're going with a gun, he knows where you are, you don't, or he has the gun and he knows he has a plan. He knows what you're likely going to be doing because he was a student here. He already knows who you are and he's watched you train this over and over. So when you have two people, you might come up with a better plan than doing the exact same thing you already trained to do, because this kid probably, and that's going back to the same thing we are talking about, where
right.
the coach versus the quarterback who has the playbook. These two individuals might be smart enough and should be smart enough to be coaches instead of quarterbacks, instead of just going off the playbook like we've showed all the students we're going to do. We're not going to do it like that. We're going to go a different route. We're going to split up and we're both going to do it this way. Or the fact that you're both going in different ways, the fact that you go to this stairwell instead of that one, the fact that you both go to a specific area where he's already been identified and he's coming down, and you set a trap for him where somebody's over here making a noise directing his attention, you come up behind him, right? It's common sense stuff. It's all
Yeah,
things
yeah.
in combat terrorists would do. And that's why it's so scary to go house to house fighting, is because you're going into their turf. And when I went through Marine Corps boot camp back in 1999, we were trained on mount, and the statistic they said is You have an 80% chance of getting shot if you go into somebody else's building. They know where all the holes are. They know which walls to shoot through. Like, you're
Yeah,
at a
yeah.
disadvantage. And so you have to turn that on them. You have to go in so fast, so violent, because you're going on, into their turf. So again, same thing with schools. We need to have two officers responding, two that are there. And this was my thought: is I understand funding and blah blah blah. You have to make it so appealing, and you have to make the position of the person that's guarding your schools so highly appreciated, and it has to actually be engaging. When I in my school system, you were the lazy, you were the untrustworthy, you were the guy who had a terrible reputation of being lazy, not wanting to take calls. So went and pulled somebody over who didn't have a driver's license, and now you're wrapped up for the next hour and a half, and now I've got to go do a suicide, a DUI, something that's going to take hours and hours of
Mm.
paperwork, going to just completely drain my entire day, my entire shift, and I'm doing your work in your district. You've got to make it to where these officers are training constantly, and you need them to be SWAT trained. And that doesn't mean they have to be on the SWAT team, but that means they have to be comfortable with going toward the sound of guns. That is not something that you learn as a police officer the way that you do in the military. The thing that I learned by being both is, when you're a police officer, day one of the police academy, you're trained, you go home at the end of the night. It does not matter what else happens. You're going home at the end of the night to your family. That's the mentality you have. And that is a complete shift from where I come from, which is the mission is the most important. You may not be coming home, but the last man standing is going to finish the mission. We're going to come back and collect your bodies. We're never going to leave you behind, but you keep going. You're not just going to stop and start picking people up. You keep going until the mission is done, because your mission is more important than your life or my life. So if I go down, yes, help me if you can. But what's more important than that is stopping this terrorist from driving a cement truck full of explosives up to the Capitol and blowing up the entire Capitol, because that's what a mission that I went on. That was more important. We have to get that guy. And it doesn't matter if all of us die. If there's one of us left, you put a bullet in that dude, because he is going to kill a bunch of innocent people. The same thing in the schools. You have to have the mentality that you are going to win, and you have to have an aggressive offensive instead of defensive. As a police officer, you're defensive. You're never going to go shoot people as a police officer. You are reacting to somebody pulling a gun out on you, and then you're returning fire. Contrary to all the garbage the media has tried to present police officers as being villains, they're not the villains, and they're not pulling out guns and just running up and just assassinating people. They are being attacked physically, beat their head into the concrete to the point where they're about to go out, and they have to pull their gun and discharge it into somebody who's actively trying to murder them. That's not racist. That's not murder on the police officer's fault because his skin is white and the guy who's trying to murder him is black. It doesn't matter. And the reality is, again, the mental shift that you have to go through, and it's not easy to go from you run into the gunfire to, no, you go home to see your family. This is a job. We want to be heroes, but we have to go home to see our families. It's unfortunate that sometimes you don't, but if you have that mentality and you go into a school shooting, you're going to get what we had at the school part, Uvalde especially, where the police officers are standing there and they're listening to kids be shot and killed in a classroom that they could have. I'm not going to sit here and judge those guys on the merits of exactly what they were hearing, of what they were
Right.
thinking at that moment. But what I know is kids were alive when they first were there, and they stood down, and whether they were told to or not, it doesn't matter. They sat and listened to kids being executed, and they knew that was happening. Caveat: when I was a police officer, I had been told by another officer who had been at a Air Force base near where I was, and I did a little bit of work there for a couple of months, and this guy was telling me, he's like, the Air Force security forces guys that were here previously, the command was so strict on us with guns. And I was like, why are they so crazy about like having 3 level holsters and not a bullet in the chamber and all these, way over the top. I'm not saying those things are way over the top, but they were way over the top with like, also, you have to be actively being shot at to even draw your firearm out of the holster. That blew my mind. I was like, dude, as a police officer on the street, I pull my gun 3 to 4 times per shift. I don't understand the people who you listen to from the old days where they never pulled their gun out of their holster and pointed it at another person their entire career. Okay, maybe Andy Griffith was real for some people, but I'm telling you, I'm not going into a house with a door wide open, pitch black in the ghetto without my gun out. That's not happening.
Yeah.
So the reality is, it's like, we've got to get people that are the Air Force mentality there. They had an incident where that happened. An airman who, not security forces, he was just one of the Air Force guys,
Right.
had guns on the base in his home, and his wife and it was either 2 kids or 3 kids. I think it was 2 kids, 3 total, were in there. She's leaving him. She's divorcing him. Everybody knows it. He's depressed. He's suicidal. All these things. He goes home early from his duty, and the police were called. Security forces are called. They show up. They sit outside. There's yelling. The police stand down though. They stay there. They don't go in. He comes out brandishing a weapon. They do not pull their guns out because they, under orders of their management, their higher ups, are not allowed to pull their gun out until he starts shooting at them. Not even shooting in the air. And again, this is the way it was relayed to me by somebody who was working as security forces when it happened and knew firsthand. And he said those guys literally sat there and listened to him execute his wife, execute his 2 children, and then commit suicide. It was still they had already been dead for half an hour. Everyone was dead for half an hour before the tactical team showed up to go inside the door with a shield. And then they were allowed to pull their guns out, but that's only the tactical team. If you're standing outside, you're not pulling your gun out.
Mm.
And that type of mentality costs innocent people their lives. Those kids shouldn't have died that day. Those
Yeah.
security forces men should have pulled their guns and stopped him right where he was. He knew he was threatening murder. He was going to kill himself. He's going to kill his wife. They didn't know that he was going to kill his kids, but you have to assume that in that
Right.
scenario.
Right.
So that's a good example of what can happen when you're training law enforcement the way that we still train law enforcement today. And what you just said has blown my mind, that anybody would tell students that they should hide first and then run second. That is so stupid, and it's not stupid. That person should be held accountable for any lost lives that would happen under their watch. And that's a big part of it. We have to start holding people that are making stupid decisions and completely illogical, not tactical. And that just goes back to, you can't put that kind of a person in charge. You have a lot of people in decision making authority and in decision making powers that are being given to mayors, to councilmen, to all these people, and they're just making up things. You watch UFC, right? You mentioned that
A
before.
little bit. Yeah. Yeah.
Joe Rogan talks about it all the time, and the referees, I'm sure,
Yeah.
hate
Yeah.
him because he makes fun of how absolutely ignorant the idea that you can't bring an elbow straight down, but you can bring an elbow down from the side. And you see these guys with these big, huge gashes in their head from where a guy brings all his weight down from a side elbow, but not straight down because people break bricks that way. And you're going, what imbecile
Yeah,
watched a
what
YouTube video of somebody breaking a couple bricks with their elbow one way and then just goes, oh, but it's okay the other way. It's that type of thing. That's what we have. We have people who have no who have no business having that type of authority and decision making, and they have this hubris, this belief that they're just going to make these decisions because it makes sense to them. There should be checks and balances. There has to be somebody who has tactical experience and
right.
expertise that has a trump card that steps in and goes, that's going to cost lives. I'm not going to do it. And again, and that's where I got
Well, we need a third party, organization, whether it's part of the government or not, that
right.
is in charge of implementing school security and making these systems, people who can prioritize in a logical way what's going to save the most lives and stuff like that. But unfortunately, it's kind of like each school is up to their own decision making to some degree, and then whether, the state's involved or not, or the mayor or the council, whoever,
Right.
influences that. Unfortunately, it's not like there's no federal standard, there's no state standard. It's kind of schools are in charge of themselves. And then as a result, like you just said, sometimes people who shouldn't be in charge of making decisions like that get put into that place of power.
Yeah.
That being said, we have gone quite a bit of time here. So I do want to have you on again to talk about something we didn't get into too much, which is the mental health aspect of school shootings.
Yeah.
Are there any mental health programs we can implement mandatorily that will prevent this? So I do want to get into that as well as some more school design with you on another episode. And then, of
Okay.
course, another episode dedicated just to your military experience and talk about military mental health, military politics, because we've done that on the show a few times. And
Yeah.
given what you did over there, what you saw, and what we spoke about before we started recording here, I know that will be a very interesting episode on its own. But for today, we've gone quite a bit into detail about school shooting prevention and awareness. Like you said, one of the biggest issues around it, one, is that people don't want to talk about it for whatever reason. And two, when it is, put into the media, people are just seeing headlines. People are getting misconstrued ideas, whether it's fake news, whether it's social media spreading misinformation, or, things are covered up over or uncovered, over time. But it's just that first initial reaction. And then once it's out of the headlines, people don't look further into whatever happened with XYZ. So
Right.
there's a lot of misconceptions around it, from mental health, from student ideology to gun and gun laws and gun control to security implementation, and even like what we ended with here, which is how should we train, how should we drill, who should we have in charge of these, decisions. So
Yeah.
Mr. Seth Ryan, I appreciate what you do. And like you mentioned your podcast. I know
Mhm.
you're going through some possible rebranding, but we're going to have the current website, in the description below. And I'll be keeping that up to date as make changes with that. But for now, we'll have school2embassyproject.com in the description below so people can find out more if they want to listen to your podcast where you do more specifics on school shootings and all of that, or just reach out to you and see what you're doing and get more information on that. So we'll have that in the description below for everyone. And it is something important to think about, especially all of us who are parents or want to be parents and are going to have our children in the school systems. Like you said, do we want do we want children going to schools and the people in charge are saying, well, capturing this shooter is more important than, protecting our children. At the end of the day,
Yeah.
no one cares about our children more than us.
Yeah.
So it's up to us to have these conversations and make sure we can enact that change.
And one thing I want to leave you with that you just said, because I think it's important with all the conversation we just had, is at the end of the day, yet you're right. It falls on you as the parent to go to the school and just to dig. Like, they're going to tell you what their, is it run, hide, fight? Is it fight, run, hide? They're going to tell you, they should be able to tell you what their plan is. And you should do that research on your own before you go putting your kid in that school system. And I know that recently there's been a lot of talk from Washington about people being able to put their students, their kids into a different school system if they so choose. And that opens a whole new ball game because a lot of parents, unfortunately, have been just kind of, this is where we live, this is the school system, this is the school district,
That's
I
how
don't
it
have a
works. Yeah.
choice. And now you might have a choice, and that might not even be coming from DC. It might have already happened. You just have to check in your area and do a little bit of research, and that might be the difference between sending your kid to a school that is much more minded toward keeping your kids alive versus making sure we get that shooter, and that I think is really important. As I mentioned, just as you mentioned, the rebrand, I have so many different topics that I want to cover, and myself and my wife are going through the IVF process now for a second time, first time successfully. And so my wife, like I say, should be pregnant in the next couple of months here. Um, but one of the topics that I am very passionate about, and I've been working in the background of, is anti-human trafficking. As a matter of fact, earlier today, I went and dropped off like 4 boxes and 2 huge trash sacks full of clothes for women who are victims of human trafficking, who are now being taught how to write a resume, how to do job applications online, and how to prepare
Have
for
life after that.
interviews,
Yeah.
and get them self-reliant, able to get back into job on their feet. And we have in Tampa, there's a safety, it's called SAFE, SAFE alliance of 20 companies that are all nonprofits who all help in anti-trafficking. And I just recorded a podcast of a guy who actually rescued a girl in Malaysia. He was an
Wow.
embassy Marine, and he helped rescue a girl. She had just been kidnapped. She had never been trafficked, and they actually got her before she was ever trafficked. So it was a right. It's the story that they should make some little miniature movie about. That's what I'm going to be going toward, as well as sharing my IVF, and then that's where I'll be sharing just about my background and any questions people have. I really want to have a dialogue with people, and
Yeah.
continuing this conversation with you is awesome. And I will always have the website for the school shootings, and I will still continue as I get quality people to talk about it on to talk about school shootings as well. So both of those will run simultaneously.
Sailing through the ocean blue, nuclear reactors my crew, guiding the ship, the stars as our guide. Through the waves we ride, jokes and laughter fill the air. On this voyage we have to share, working together, side by side, as one family we will abide. In the heart of the ship we reside, nuclear operators with pride, powering the vessel with every stride. Our mission, a source of great pride.